Explore the turning points of history with Global Chronicles. In the 20th century, the world was gripped by a fierce ideological battle: communism versus capitalism. At the forefront of this battle stood the United States, committed to containing the spread of communism across the globe, and the Soviet Union, a champion of communist ideologies. But there was one battleground that would test this global divide like no other: the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, in a nation called Vietnam. The Vietnam War wasn't just a local conflict, it was the epicenter of Cold War tension, a clash between two superpowers vying for global dominance. And at the heart of this conflict, two nations stood face to face: North Vietnam, backed by communist allies, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its Western allies. The seeds of the Vietnam War were sown decades earlier, during World War II. Japan occupied Vietnam, but after Japan's defeat in 1945, a new struggle emerged. France, seeking to reclaim its colonial territory, fought to regain control. But the Vietnamese, led by a determined revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh, had other plans. Ho Chi Minh, inspired by communist ideology and backed by the Soviet Union and China, sought an independent Vietnam under communist rule. After years of brutal fighting, the French were defeated at the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Vietnam was split into two: North Vietnam under communist control, and South Vietnam, a pro-Western republic. But this was only the beginning. The United States saw the rise of communism in North Vietnam as part of a larger threat. This was the era of the domino theory, the belief that if one nation fell to communism, others in the region would follow. To the American leadership, losing Vietnam meant losing Southeast Asia. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy began sending military advisors to support the government of South Vietnam. The goal was simple: train South Vietnamese forces to resist the growing communist insurgency known as the Viet Cong. But as the Viet Cong gained ground, the conflict escalated, and the United States found itself entangled in a full-scale war. In 1964, a pivotal moment occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin. Reports of North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. naval vessels gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the green light to escalate American involvement. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting Johnson broad powers to wage war in Vietnam. By 1965, tens of thousands of U.S. troops were on the ground in Vietnam. The war was no longer just about helping the South Vietnamese defend themselves. It became America's war. But what the U.S. military thought would be a swift and decisive victory soon turned into a long and bloody stalemate. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the United States had fought before. It was fought not only on the battlefield but in the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and the dense jungle to their advantage. U.S. forces, armed with superior technology and firepower, struggled to adapt. As the war dragged on, brutal tactics such as napalm bombings and Agent Orange were used to clear the jungles and flush out the enemy. But you know, these strategies caused immense suffering for civilians and deepened anti-American sentiment in Vietnam and abroad. Meanwhile, back in the United States, a new battle was brewing: public opinion. This was no longer just a Vietnamese civil war. The world had taken sides. North Vietnam received vital support from the Soviet Union and China. Supplies, weapons, and strategic advice flowed in from communist allies. The US, on the other hand, was backed by Australia, South Korea, Thailand, and other anti-communist nations. But cracks in this coalition were starting to show. As the war raged, anti-war movements spread across the globe. Protesters in the US, Europe, and even within South Vietnam demanded an end to the conflict, condemning the violence and the seeming futility of the war. Then came the Tet Offensive in 1968, a coordinated series of attacks by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong across South Vietnam during what was supposed to be a holiday ceasefire. US forces managed to repel the attacks, but the damage was done. The Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that the US was winning the war. Back home, public support plummeted. The American government, now under President Richard Nixon, began seeking a way out of the war. By 1973, The US had signed the Paris Peace Accords and began withdrawing its troops. But the peace was fragile. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched their final assault on South Vietnam. The capital, Saigon, fell in April, marking the end of the war. The consequences were devastating. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, but at a heavy cost. Millions of lives lost, cities in ruins, and a legacy of pain that still echoes today. For the US, the war left a deep scar, a divided nation questioning its role in the world. The Vietnam War changed the world. It altered the balance of power in Southeast Asia, weakened American resolve to intervene in foreign conflicts, and gave rise to a new era of Cold War diplomacy. For Vietnam, the war's legacy lives on in the people, the land, and the memories of those who lived through it. Today, Vietnam has rebuilt itself into a growing economy, yet the ghosts of the past remain. The Vietnam War serves as a reminder of the costs of war, the complexities of global conflict, and the enduring quest for peace. Keep exploring the events that shaped our world. Subscribe to Global Chronicles for more and comment the events you want to listen from us.